wired to all of these things. But really, regardless of where you are today, hopefully you'll find a few things that apply now and perhaps some to take away with you. We're going to be starting today by thinking about the various tensions and challenges that come up after receiving a diagnosis. So specifically when we start thinking about work and life and really how everything is going to be coming together, it's important to recognize that a lot of questions begin to crop up. And sometimes the answers to these questions are naturally in conflict with one another. But there are two overarching questions that you can ask that can really start to illuminate the best path forward for you. So first, how important is work to you personally? And then what information do you actually need in order to make good decisions about work? So inevitably, this will likely lead to additional questions, because as we know, what we want is not always what we can do. So really it's about how to find a path that's workable for you. Some additional questions to consider include how will work affect your treatment and schedule and vice versa. When talking with your healthcare team about that, it's going to be really important that you're going to think about things like what are side effects likely to kick in? We know with some treatments, people might feel unwell almost immediately, in which case maybe they can schedule a treatment for a Friday so they have a weekend to recover. Other treatment protocols, the effects don't really kick in until a few days later. So you might want to schedule an appointment for a Wednesday, which might make more sense. I really encourage you to be proactive and ask for times that work best for you. And keep in mind that no person is only their diagnosis and their job. So what other things will you want to save some of your energy for? A new hobby or a personal project? Maybe you're the one who does all the cooking and cleaning in the home. The truth is that each of us has a very limited pool of internal resources and energy, and we divvy that up into our own personal pie charts. So when cancer gets added into the mix, that pie gets smaller as treatment continues and prioritizing becomes even more important. For many people, finances and insurance are tied to their jobs and are central to making decisions around work. Often those are the driving factors in determining whether to work during treatment or not. Or maybe they're important, but they're not the number one reason. Many people want to continue working because first and foremost, it's part of their identity. It's who they are. Particularly in our country, where when we meet someone for the first time, we ask, what do you do? Not what's your favorite food or have you read any good books lately? We're basically asking, how do you contribute to the world? And this is a pretty profound question to be asked and to answer. So for some people, finding out that their ability to work will be compromised can lead to a secondary crisis, an identity crisis. In these cases, it can be helpful to talk to your healthcare team, including social workers and support systems like CSC, about ways in which you can take care of yourself emotionally if it does look like your capacity to work may be a little bit impacted. So moving on to answering these questions and making decisions, you're going to need to do a lot of information gathering. This slide illustrates the three buckets into which information can be sorted. So we've already talked about the first bucket, which is medical and treatment information, but I do want to make another point, which is that it's really important to share specific information with your healthcare team about what you do for work. So for instance, it's not necessarily enough to tell them that I'm in sales or even that I'm an administrator at a school. You need to provide details about your day-to-day routine and responsibilities, so they have a better idea of what your day-to-day really looks like and how it might be impacted. The next bucket is work information. Here you'll want to look into benefits that you have, such as paid time off and health insurance, but also existing workplace policies, such as donated leave pools. This information is typically found in the employee handbook or the initial paperwork that you sign when you get the job. And this third category is legal information. And as I mentioned, I am a social worker, not an attorney. So while I'm going to talk about the law, I do so in very general and basic terms. But I do strongly encourage anyone who has specific questions about their situation to reach out to a legal professional. And the law plays a very important role in thinking about and talking about working cancer, and that's why we include it here. Understandably, for some, it can seem scary to think about the law and our jobs. But I want to emphasize that the point of discussing this topic is not because I think it's likely that an employment situation will become litigious. Rather, it's because legal and practical issues don't exist in separate vacuums. Often, where there is a practical concern, there's a legal piece to it as well. So for many people, the law becomes a very valuable tool for helping them create a plan for working through treatment. I want to start by mentioning an important law that's often the key tool in navigating work after cancer, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act. So my goal in giving you a little background today on the ADA is that it's something that you should look further into based on your own specific situation. But to start, the ADA is a federal law, meaning it applies in all 50 states. The part that's relevant to work in cancer comes from Title I, and like all laws, it has certain requirements that must be met to use it. So in very broad strokes, they are that your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. You must have the necessary skills, certifications, and qualifications to do the job. And your disability must meet the criteria as determined by the ADA. So if you meet all of these requirements, the ADA can protect you from discrimination and may also provide access to reasonable accommodations, which I will circle back to later on in this presentation. Again, this is just a quick overview, so you know the ADA is something to consider. Also, it's important to note that you may be further protected by a state fair employment law. For example, New York's minimum is less than 15 employees. So I encourage you to speak with a legal professional to determine if you're eligible to use the ADA's protections. You can also see here on the bottom of this slide that we have a couple of links to Triage Cancer's website and ours as well, just outlining some of the foundational information about the laws as well. So I want to now talk a little bit about the online space. So at Cancer and Careers, we hear often from survivors about the role that the internet is playing in helping them through their cancer experience. For many, it creates a sense of community and a way to feel better in the moment. But it also creates a written record of information that can be difficult to get rid of. At the same time, research indicates that more and more employers and hiring managers are Googling employees and prospective candidates. And I want to say not necessarily to find something negative, but rather to get additional information about the people that they work with, or to confirm something that they already like about a particular candidate. But still, it's possible that they'll come across information that the person would prefer their employer didn't know. So I want to be clear, I'm not saying never post anything online, since it actually can be a good thing to have a presence online. But rather, it's important for people to have a better understanding of the virtual landscape so they can make informed decisions about how their story is being presented online. So some of you might be thinking that you're always very careful with your privacy settings. So doesn't that mean that you're protected? And unfortunately, the answer to that is that it's a little bit more complicated. So one of the reasons it's so important to make clear decisions about what specifically you're going to share online is that privacy policies on mainstream social media platforms are constantly changing. So Facebook and sites like it are designed to sell us things. So in order to keep making new deals with advertisers, they change their privacy policies frequently and very often without notice. So on the plus side, that's one of the reasons we don't have to pay for Facebook or Instagram, but it does make trying to keep up with these changes pretty impractical and time consuming. So the idea here is that you want to be thinking about the fact that even in these online spaces where you've connected with people and they've connected with you, and there are privacy settings, it doesn't mean that it's a perfectly secure and structured system. So as an alternative, which some of you may already be familiar with, there are two sites, My Lifeline and CaringBridge. For those of you who aren't, they're both social networking sites designed specifically to be a safer space to share updates about your cancer experience. They are a more controlled environment and have a higher level of privacy than the mainstream social media networks. But while their privacy policies are easier to follow, profiles are not 100% automatically protected. So if you're going to use these sites, it's worth taking the time to really understand the privacy policies, figure out protections that are offered by each level of security, and figure out which one is going to work best for you. Really, in general, it's a good idea to review the privacy policies for any website where you're going to be sharing personal information. This link at the bottom of this slide is to our chart and checklist, which walks you through how to make a completely secure profile on these sites. So if you're interested in checking that out. So we now know that many privacy policies provide very imperfect protection. So the question is, what other steps can be taken? We recommend developing a personal disclosure plan. One step is to make clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to share online and off, and where are you going to share it in terms of specific websites or blogs. As you're thinking through what's going to work best for you, it's a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. So it may be the case that some of you have disclosed at work and everyone's being really supportive, and that's an outstanding situation to be in. But the fact is the internet doesn't go away. So it's important to think beyond right now and consider what the possible long-term impact might be, because none of us can predict the future. You may find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or your really supportive boss may move on and be replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And really, there's no way to know how that person is going to respond to the information that they find. Then, once you've made these decisions, communicate them with the people in your network, whether they're friends or family or people that you've connected to online. Excuse me. And even if you have shared your preferences with your loved ones, it's still a good idea to monitor what others are posting about you, so you have a sense of what's out there. And this then leads us to the question, what can you do to take control of what shows up about you in a Google search? Happily, I can say that there are plenty of opportunities to take control about what comes up about you in searches by taking a strategic approach to what you post online. People don't know what you don't share with them. And in a work context, social media can be a forum where you can not only tell, but also show people who you are as a professional. Social media sites like LinkedIn, Twitter, and the others that you see listed here on this slide rank really high in Google searches. So by becoming active on these sites and presenting a voice that represents who you are as a professional, it can be a really excellent way to help elevate your brand. Now that said, keep in mind, different platforms have different audiences. So you may share your thoughts about a novel that you read on Twitter, but on LinkedIn, that's really not that appropriate unless you work in publishing. LinkedIn is more a space to let people know you have a certain certification or that you wrote a blog about your industry or got promoted. When building an online brand, you want to think strategically about what you post. We recommend running each post through a filter and asking yourself questions like these. Would I want a boss, future or current, to know this about me? Would I want this on the front page of a newspaper or the homepage of my favorite news site? Would I want my grandmother to see this? You can delete posts that no longer represent your interests, but keep in mind that though they may be harder to find, they still will be out there somewhere. So now I want to transition from the online space back into the actual work environment. Excuse me. I think everyone's still with me. So here's some data to set the scene, which comes from a survey that we conducted with Harris Poll in 2019. First, you'll see the top 5 reasons that survivors want to continue working after a diagnosis. While typically financial reasons and health insurance are rated as highly important, which is probably not surprising, what's significant here is that 60% of survivors wanted to keep working because they felt productive. And work also played a large role in helping things to feel normal, whatever normal was for them, and to feel productive and busy. Also, a solid 75% of employed survivors reported that working during treatment helped them to cope during their cancer journey. So really what all of this illustrates is the point that we discussed earlier, that work provides a sense of meaning and purpose, and also that the act of working itself is beneficial for many people while they're going through active treatment. So this leads us to the next question, and it's, do I have to share the news of my diagnosis at work? Now, when it comes to disclosing at work, like the rest of the decision around sharing this news at all, it's an incredibly personal decision and one that requires a lot of thought. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario. But just so that we're all on the same page for today, you're not required to provide information about your health or health history to your employer, current or prospective, nor can they ask. That said, there can be situations where you might have to share information in order to access your rights under the law. This doesn't mean sharing every last detail about your diagnosis or your prognosis. It just means you might have to provide some support for why you are eligible for whatever it is that you're asking for. So for example, it might be difficult to credibly file a complaint against your employer for discrimination under the ADA if they had no idea technically that you had a condition to discriminate against. So really, as you're thinking through whether to share or not, it's important to consider all of the angles. When I get questions regarding whether or not to disclose, I like to say that you can always say more later, but you can't erase something that's already been said. If there's a need for you to divulge more information down the road, you can certainly be prepared to do so, and it might be a good idea, but you don't have to offer it up right away. And again, here are some links at the bottom of this slide that can provide a little bit more guidance on the disclosure aspect. So when deciding whether or not to share this information about your cancer status at work specifically, there's two major things to consider. How will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And what are the legal benefits to sharing this information? It's important to note that people may want to disclose for a variety of reasons. For example, personal communication style. Some people are born sharers, period. They couldn't imagine going through such a big life-changing event and not telling others. Then there are those who are much more private and in fact feel uncomfortable sharing personal information. So it's really about knowing yourself and knowing that however you feel about sharing is valid and it should be taken into account. So the individual culture of the workplace may also play a role. Do you work at a small company where your colleagues feel like a second family and everyone chats about their weekends, kids, and vacations? Or perhaps it's a big corporation where an environment is much more competitive and people are always heads down working. Thinking about the ways that people communicate with each other on the job can help you to decide if, how, and how much of that information you want to share at work. You might also want to think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar. You may not know someone specifically going through cancer treatment, but perhaps a coworker went out on maternity leave or is caring for an Asian parent. What kinds of flexibilities did the workplace provide for them, if any? And how is the news received, both by managers and other members of the team? Were people willing to step up and pitch in, or were there grumbling behind people's backs about having to take on extra responsibilities? This can be really valuable to consider in these situations as you think about what you can expect out of your own experience if you do decide to share that information. We also get asked a lot, who should I tell? And as with so much of this, it will vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. If you do decide to tell, we recommend starting with whoever might be easiest to talk to. For some people, that's a direct supervisor because there's someone whom you can have an ongoing conversation with, and they can also be an advocate for you with higher ups. But it's also important to bear in mind that most managers were never formally trained to be managers, as I'm sure many of us have experienced before. So in this case, it can often put the burden on the employee with cancer to help teach that manager what to do next. And I just want to point out really quickly, the link on the bottom of this slide is to a manager's toolkit that we offer. And it's basically a packet of information that you can hand right to your supervisor to help them understand your situation, how to best support you, and a little bit more color as to what you're going through. Now, for other people, speaking with their supervisor is not an option. So they might want to go to human resources instead, if their company has an HR department. But really, perhaps the most important thing to convey in any of these conversations is the idea that treatment is going to be fluid. You're sharing what you know today, but it might not apply next month or 6 months from now. And so letting them know that this is likely going to be an ongoing conversation can set more realistic expectations. So with all that said, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling in terms of a conversation at work is one that can be intimidating for a lot of survivors, and that's totally understandable. So here are a couple of examples of how you might start that conversation. But overall, when you're preparing to begin these conversations, just be sure to weave in the idea that you want to collaborate with your employer to create a plan that ensures that both your needs and their needs are being met. So I'll just give you a moment to read what's on these slides. So you also want to think about the reality of your physical self in the workplace and how you personally are going to manage the potential side effects of your treatment on the job. There's a wide array of possible side effects. So as we discussed earlier, you want to find out from your healthcare team which ones you are likely to experience and how those might be managed at work so that you can feel both comfortable and productive. It is also important to think about potential visible side effects, especially if you choose or have chosen not to disclose any information at work. Because if your colleagues start to notice that you're losing weight or losing hair, or perhaps that your energy has dropped and you don't seem like your usual self, they may begin to ask questions. And typically these kinds of questions come from a place of kindness and concern, but they can also catch people off guard and create a situation wherein people end up disclosing something that they may not have intended to. So it's really smart to spend some time planning out potential answers to some of those questions. And this is another area where social workers and support groups can be really helpful. So as we discuss side effects, chemo brain and brain fog is one we get asked about most frequently. This type of fog can come about whether you've received chemotherapy or not. While there is no magic bullet solution, unfortunately, one piece of advice is to let go of the idea of multitasking, because studies show that only 2% of people multitask effectively, and I am certainly speaking from my own experience. So to combat this, we recommend just going back to basics. Write down a list of priorities, turn off phone or email notifications so they don't cause you distractions, and really focus on one thing at a time. Writing everything down is a really great practice, so you always have a record and don't really have to rely on your memory as much. Try to keep a single notebook with all of your to-do things in one place. It's much easier to keep track of that one notebook with a sticker on it, so you don't wind up in a meeting with your grocery list as opposed to your talking points. Also, it's a good idea to take time to rehearse everything from presentations, project updates, and even phone calls. If you work in an office type environment that has a shared calendar, you may want to schedule time for yourself on that calendar so people know that you're busy. Also, simple stress relief practices can go a really long way to helping you improve your focus. Deep breathing exercises or 2 to 3 minutes of meditation can easily be done at a desk or while taking a walk. It's important to remember that a little bit can go a long way in terms of helping us to hit the reset button when it's necessary. Now, your disclosure decisions will drive some of your strategy around how you communicate at work. One option is to identify a point person. This may not be feasible in all environments, but in settings where it works, it can be an excellent solution. Someone who you trust that's willing to be a centralized source of information about you, your health, and your schedule can also prevent you from having to constantly update everyone on how you're feeling. That person can also be your go-to to find out about what's happening at work if you need to be away or for a doctor's appointment or any other reason. It's also important to be clear about your priorities and have a good understanding of what your team is expecting from you and how you plan to deliver it. Whether or not you've disclosed, this is something you should do in collaboration with your supervisor if possible. And then there's this final point, and it's about limits, and this can be a real challenge. This is a time when it's critical that you're honest with yourself about what you can and can't do at work, and that you set fair boundaries and stick to them. Something to keep in mind here is that the way we articulate our needs in the workplace is going to be different than how we articulate those with loved ones. So at home, when we've reached our limit or hit a wall, we might be able to express ourselves in a more verbal, loud, slam the door kind of way. Obviously at work, that is unlikely to be acceptable. So the other piece of this is really figuring out where those limits are and recognizing the signs before you reach that point. This way you can recalibrate before it happens. What can often help with this is to rehearse what we call professional no's. And here are a few examples. You're approached by your boss about a new project and you can respond by saying, I appreciate that you thought of me for this project, but I'm a bit swamped this week and I'm concerned about my ability to get this back to you in a timely manner. You're letting them know that you are open to it in future situations, but right now is just really not the time. So this brings us to reasonable accommodations as another strategy. As you make the return to work, reasonable accommodations are one benefit of the ADA if you qualify. So basically, these are tools that can be used to make working through treatment or returning to work after treatment much more manageable. So it's much easier to think about how these might work with examples, and I've broken them up into categories for you in the next couple of slides. But before we move on, I just want to note that there is a lot of information available on what reasonable accommodations are, how to use them, and how they can be valuable for both you and your employer. Some of these resources are listed below. Another helpful place to look is the Q&A section on ada.gov, where they outline a lot more of the specific information about the ADA. So let's talk about SUE. One type of accommodation that might be made is in your workspace, which means the actual environmental challenges that exist at work. So again, the best way to talk about this is to give an example. We worked with a young woman who was a social worker and was going through cancer treatment. Work was incredibly important to her overall well-being and her sense of self. One of her side effects was nausea, which wasn't necessarily impossible for her to manage, but what she began to note was that it was exacerbated when she was at work to a degree that became unmanageable. She realized that it wasn't as bad at home, after work, or during the same hours on a weekend. So it really seemed strange to her that she was so sick at work specifically. So we zeroed in on that, and through some conversations realized that her office was next to the cafeteria, and that's what was making her nausea so bad. In this case, her accommodation was to change offices. This didn't mean that going through cancer treatment was a breeze, but it certainly changed her ability to work, which for her was really critical. Another example is a gentleman who worked in the finance department, and one of his side effects was extreme fatigue. His role included a lot of printing, but for some inexplicable reason, the printers and scanners were located 2 floors below him, and the most direct way to get there was via the stairs. So he's going up and down the stairs all day long to retrieve documents, essentially walking extra miles every day. His fatigue clearly made this process much more challenging, so ultimately his accommodation was to get a printer at his desk. So as you can see, there's really no one-size-fits-all accommodation in an environmental way for a person. It's about peeling away the layers of what's happening in your workspace, and this can take some time to do, as it did with the social worker in the cafeteria. And then it's really about being creative about possible solutions. Oops, sorry. So there's a number of questions that you can ask yourself to identify other potential accommodations. So for example, can you work a full-time but flexible schedule? So this would mean you ultimately work the same number of hours. They would just be distributed differently. Varying the start and end times of the workday to maximize the hours that you're feeling best can be a huge help. So a 9 to 5 day might become a 7 to 3 p.m. day if you feel your best early in the morning. Or if you take time out during the workday to go to appointments, you can make up that time by working later that day or later in the week. If your job includes allocated break times, is it possible for you to take more frequent or additional breaks? So let's say your schedule entitles you to 2 breaks and a 45-minute lunch. But what you find you really need is a total of 4 breaks in your day. Those extra breaks could potentially be considered an accommodation. Again, these examples are really meant to just help you to start thinking about accommodations and also to remove some of the myths around the concept, such as accommodations are expensive or unlikely to be approved. The fact is that according to the Job Accommodation Network, most accommodations cost nothing at all or cost an employer $500 or less. So be resourceful and really think about your environment and what might be causing the specific challenges that you're experiencing. And also remember that it's all fluid. What would make work easier today might be different tomorrow, and this isn't a one-time only opportunity. Now, returning to an existing job can present challenges whether you've been away for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or even more. There's pros and cons to returning to a former job. Probably the biggest pro is that it's a familiar landscape. You know the culture and quirks, you know your colleagues, you know the responsibilities that are associated with your particular role. And all of these things mean you won't have to spend time assessing and acclimating to a new work environment. Of course, there are also cons associated with returning to a previous job. There's the very sneaky and sometimes insidious before cancer picture. So it's wise to remind yourself that it's okay. And in fact, it's a good idea to ease back into the routine. Remind, obviously, is an operative word, as this is often easier said than done, but it's a helpful seed to have planted in the back of your mind. At CSC, we frequently hear from patients that they have a very real fear that they're going to be branded as the cancer person in their office forever. We've heard stories about colleagues making cancer-related comments to people who are returning to work, and typically they are well-intended attempts to connect with the person in some way, but they can often feel very off-putting for that person. So in order to address some of these comments and questions, we suggest a verbal technique called the swivel. This is a verbal formula or pattern that's used in response to a cancer-related comment that might be made by one of those well-intended colleagues. Ultimately, it involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an "and" right in the middle, and swiveling the conversation around to a topic that's more work-oriented and appropriate. So, for example, someone comes up to you when you've returned to work and says, "You know, my uncle had cancer." You can respond, "I'm really sorry to hear that. That must have been hard. And hey, what did you think about that meeting we had yesterday?" It might feel a little bit abrupt, but it lets them know that you're really interested in focusing on work and having them see you as a coworker and not a coworker with cancer. Being able to shift this conversation back to a place where you feel comfortable can also be really empowering. And it really indicates to your colleagues that you're still that whole vibrant person with plenty of professional contributions to make. Of course, there's a whole spectrum of comments that you may encounter in the workplace. Here's a few additional examples of how you might use the swivel when encountering one of those well-intended but off-putting comments. Unfortunately, there are also those who make comments that are just outright insensitive, like the example on this slide. What really drives home this idea. What this really drives home is the idea that it can be useful to sit down and think about how you personally might respond if someone were to make a comment like this. That way, it's a language that sounds like you. You might even want to write it down and practice saying it out loud so that the words feel comfortable coming out of your mouth. Again, this is an area where social workers can be really helpful for practicing these types of scenarios. So we're now going to spend a little bit of time talking about the job search. And again, here's some data from the 2019 survey with Harris Poll that sets us up for this conversation. The first 3 data points are responses from patients and survivors who are looking for work. These are all valid concerns, given the 2 stats listed below, like applicants who disclosed their cancer history received fewer callbacks from managers than those who did not disclose their cancer history. I'm sharing this information with you not to scare you or to paint a negative picture, but rather so you have this information in the back of your mind to make you the savviest candidate during your job search and really having specific considerations in mind. We're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about disclosure during the job search. So hopefully you finish listening to this presentation feeling a little bit more empowered around that piece of the puzzle and with a little better idea of knowing what you would do in this situation. So with the job search, it's no secret that there are many challenges and unknowns when you're looking for a new job. It can feel scary, and particularly during this challenging time, it might seem impossible to do. So to start, remember that looking for a job is a process that can take time. And while it might not feel this way right now, you should think about what you want, not just what you need, and then be strategic in your approach. The job hunt also comes with huge ups and downs, so having a support system to talk to about this can really help you through the process. We've also noticed over the years that people in the cancer community tend to hold themselves to a higher standard than others who are looking for work. Often, survivors feel obligated to share health history than they have to or even should. We like to say that job searching is like building any relationship. It's all about timing with various steps involved. The process builds upon itself, and it can be heavily focused on a great first impression. So in this case, your resume, cover letter, or LinkedIn profile. So if we use dating as an example of relationship building, the first phone conversation with a potential date is going to have a different feel to it than a marriage proposal. So if someone shows up on a first date and they're like an open book, sharing all of their idiosyncrasies and quirks immediately, that's going to read much differently than if that same information comes up in 6 weeks or 6 months. In the same way, you're not going to go on a first job interview and admit that you chew gum really loudly or that you always sign on to your Zoom meetings just a couple minutes late. I encourage you to keep in mind that it's important to behave appropriately in the context of which stage you're at in the job search process. And projecting appropriate confidence and control is a really great way to do so. Finally, during this time where so much can feel and is out of our control, there are elements of job searching you can focus on right now that are completely within your control. Things like working on your resume, perfecting a cover letter, and getting into the habit of networking and embracing the new virtual way that everyone's connecting. So there's also certain things you should consider if you're job searching right now during COVID-19. Besides the practical questions like what companies are hiring and what jobs are available, you'll also want to find out the safety measures and policies that employers are implementing and how important those are to you. This will likely be unique to your specific situation, so think about what you're comfortable with and what's safe. And this should likely include conversations with your healthcare provider if you are looking for jobs that might need to be in person right away. So this brings us to networking. According to one of our career coaches, currently more than 85% of jobs are found through other people versus through job boards, headhunters, or ads. So it does go without saying that networking is a necessary part of the job hunting process. I think a lot of people tend to struggle with the idea of networking because it feels like they're asking for a favor. This can feel especially challenging if you've been out of the game for a while due to treatment or recovery. But the fact is that basically anyone you know can be a source for networking. People on this call can be a source for networking. There's also a great online resource for this, LinkedIn, and it's become the go-to source for employers looking to hire. According to a recent study, 87% of recruiters reported that LinkedIn is the most effective tool when vetting during the job process. So given that it's being used so much to find talent, you want to make sure that you're utilizing it to its fullest potential. And I do want to point out that we will be hosting a webinar on building an effective LinkedIn profile, which will be presented by one of our career coaches, I believe in April. So definitely check that out if you're interested in beefing up your profile. So as important as LinkedIn and your overall online presence are for job searching, they don't replace these time-tested tools of job hunting, starting with the resume and cover letter. I'm likely not telling you something you don't already know, but I'm quickly going to review some tips on how to write them. So an effective resume is one that's written with a particular audience in mind. It's professional, easy to read. It summarizes your accomplishments succinctly rather than being an exhaustive list of everything you've ever done. And the rule of thumb is 1 page for early career professionals and 2 pages for someone who's a bit more seasoned. It's also helpful to know that there's more than one type of resume. So the most common is the chronological, which takes the reader through a candidate's work experience job by job, beginning with the most recent. But there is also another one called the chronological functional resume, more of a hybrid, and could be preferable for someone who might have some gaps in their work history that they're concerned about. This isn't as common, but it can be a really great option if you do feel that gaps are holding you back. So as mentioned, also vitally important is the cover letter. Along with your resume, it does help you get in the door. It's important to make sure that a cover letter isn't simply a regurgitation of your resume. Make sure that it's tailored to the specific job you're applying for. And remember, it's an opportunity to draw parallels or highlight an experience that makes you uniquely suited to the specific role. You'll also want to make connections between your specific skill set and experiences to the specific job and company that you're interested in. The more specific information that you provide in the cover letter, the more it shows the potential employer that you are specifically interested in them. So, as I mentioned, disclosure is an important aspect to consider when it comes to the job search. A lot of people ask us if they should include their cancer experience in their resume or cover letter, either as a positive or as an explanation of some sort. My first response is always do whatever you're comfortable with, but think about it this way. The goal of a cover letter and resume are to get you an interview based on your skills and potential. So in that sense, your diagnosis and treatment aren't really part of that conversation. Another important thing to consider is the fact that if you disclose your diagnosis in a letter, It won't be a dynamic exchange. And by that, I mean that you won't physically be there when the employer initially absorbs this information. So you won't have the opportunity to explain anything or answer any questions they may have, or more importantly, to steer them back to the questions about your skills. So the bottom line is that no one tells everything about everything during a job interview, or even once they're hired. So communicate appropriately for where you are in the process and do whatever feels right for you. However, even if you are 100% sure that you want to disclose during the hiring process, the cover letter and resume are not really the best way to do that. If you do feel it's important to let your employer know about your health or your health history before you accept a job, and I've absolutely met a number of people for whom that was very important, we typically recommend that you wait until later in the hiring process. This way, everyone involved in hiring has a chance to spend time with you and get a sense of who you are as a person, as an employee. This way, instead of just reading that information in your cover letter and putting it immediately into the no pile, they'll have already gotten to know you a little bit. So if you think back to the job searching as like dating conversation we had earlier, it's about sharing information based on where you are in the process. And of course, always remembering that you're never required to share that information. It's a personal decision. So when asked about a resume gap, putting a positive spin on the situation can help greatly to put the recruiter or interviewer at ease. And it can also confirm that the gap doesn't have to do with a negative work ethic or laziness. Now, since it's possible and totally reasonable that you'll be asked about a gap on your resume, it is a good idea just to be prepared with some answers. If it comes up, be future focused, non-specific, and brief. Here, this slide has a couple of useful examples that might be used in an interview situation. Again, spend some time figuring out language that feels right and comfortable for you. Of course, we want to make sure that your answer acknowledges their question, but it also swivels the interviewer's attention back to the job in question, the desire to get hired, and of course, the skill set that's on the table. And just so you know, the link at the bottom of this slide has some examples of mock interviews so you can get a sense of what they might look like. Now, despite some of the negatives of Google that we discussed earlier, one of the upsides is that you can use it to research a prospective employer, and you definitely should. You want to find out as much as you can about a company before you meet with them. Obviously, knowing about the company is going to help you sound informed in the interview, but it's also smart to spend some time thinking about whether the company is going to be a good fit for your needs. If your interview is a result of having networked with someone on staff there, you probably already have a sense of what it's like to work at the organization, but you'll still want to search for additional information. In other words, you really want to do some fact-finding beyond the conversation that happens as part of the interview process. I find that Glassdoor can be a really great resource for this. Anywhere that an employee can be anonymous, they'll be much more honest, and you can get a sense of what it's really like there. So, working in a new job with a new employer, there are also pros and cons that are kind of the opposite to the ones that we talked about when returning to your existing role. So one of the best things about starting a new job with a new employer is that it's a fresh start. According to our career coaches, research shows that your first 90 days in a new job are the make it or break it time for success. This is the time that you're assimilating, managing your energy, meeting new people, learning the culture, and developing relationships. Remember, you don't need to work a million hours. You should focus instead on creating a simple plan for the things I mentioned. And you should break everything down into small pieces whenever it feels overwhelming. It's important for you to learn and understand what it means to be successful in your new company, and to remember every company is a little dysfunctional, no matter who they are. It's important to take care of yourself physically and mentally. And remember that people don't get hired in the hopes that they'll fail. They get hired in the hopes that they'll succeed and help the company. Finding the right person for a job is time-consuming and costly. So your new employer is going to want to do everything possible to make a success out of your employment. So some of these new things, you can ask for accommodations if you do need them. But I really recommend just finding out what their expectations of you are and finding out what success really means there, because it really can vary from job to job. So that is it for me in terms of content tonight. I do want to just point out a couple of our events that are coming up. We do have a number of webinars throughout the year. We have one per month this year. We have one next week on managing long-term stress, which will be presented by a licensed clinical social worker. And as you can see, we have some job search ones coming up. The full list of our schedule is on our website. And here's a few links to some of our other services. As I mentioned, we have a resume review service, our free publications on our Ask a Career Coach board, and also a few legal resources that can be helpful if you are experiencing any of these scenarios that we discussed earlier. And I do want to just leave you with my contact information. As Rachel mentioned, we will have time for Q&A tonight, but if anything comes up afterwards, feel free to reach out to me, and also feel free to follow us on any of our social media or sign up for our newsletter for any updates. And now I will hand it back to Rachel.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole. This was so informative. And for those of you that joined a bit late, just so you know, Nicole is going to share these slides with me. So I'll email it to all of you once I receive those slides. But I would love to open it up. If anybody has questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type questions into the chat. Any questions?
I have one question. You did mention, you talked a bit about, how, and for many good reasons, it's recommended to not disclose your cancer diagnosis right off the bat, like in your cover letter, early on in the hiring process. Obviously, like, you're not required to in any way, but is there like a certain, I guess, like, caution to take between, like, you talked a lot about special accommodations, and if you know beforehand that, like, your diagnosis, whether it's current or past, like, effects of it are going to require special accommodations, that, like, you should mention it before, because on one hand, like, you don't need to, and, like, legally can't be required to, but then I would kind of be scared to, like, to upset a potential employer by, like, getting hired and going, like, oh, hey, by the way, I'm gonna need this, this, and this, because, like, how, like, when it comes to gauging like that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's a completely personal decision, and I'm by no means saying that you shouldn't disclose if you feel that it's something that you need. When you are looking for a job, you are entitled to ask for accommodations. What can be helpful is to understand what the role is, and sometimes why it is beneficial to wait is because you might not know exactly what you're going to be doing. If you've done a similar role, you might have a sense of it, but as we all know, our job descriptions are not the entirety of our jobs, right? And so there can tend to be different things associated with it. But it's also important to keep in mind, like what I said earlier, is that even if you disclose some information, it doesn't have to be all information. So let's say, for instance, you have neuropathy in your hands and typing is really challenging for you and it hurts. You don't necessarily need to tell them that it's due to cancer. You can say you suffer from neuropathy. Is there an option for, speak to type software or something like that? Or if you are having a lot of joint pain, or you are having certain bodily problems from your treatment, maybe a specific ergonomic chair or something like that. So just kind of keeping in mind that you don't always have to tell them everything about why you're asking for what you're asking for. But it's also a good idea to, know a little bit about the company before you say anything. It's not like you're duping them if you get hired and then you ask for something. And I think that a lot of people are worried about that they're tricking the employer. But at the end of the day, the reason why you would get hired is for your skill set. And if you get hired, it's because they like you and they want you to succeed, and they want to help you succeed. So if they're called reasonable accommodations for a reason, right? They're reasonable. They're not going to make the company bend over backwards or have to spend a ton of money on you. But that means that they will have your skills and your experience and you as an individual at their company. So it's really just about thinking about what you need, Is it something that they need to, are you going to need it on day one in order to do this job? Or is it something that you might need? I recommend, if it's something that you might need, starting the job and finding out if you really need it or not. But again, it's totally up to you, and it's about what you know about them, and it's also about what you know about you. And also speaking with healthcare professionals can be really helpful in terms of just identifying if it will be an issue.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
A quick question, well, a couple questions just about re-entry into the workforce.
Mhm.
I mean, I would imagine after an extended leave, like sometimes maybe you don't remember how to complete some of your job responsibilities, or you just need like a refresher around different skill sets that your position requires. So I'm just wondering if you have any feedback about that re-entry process and what to ask of your employer if you need just kind of a refresher.
Sure. I mean, you know, if you are concerned about the return to work, it can be a good idea to just come up with a reasonable, practical plan. It's unlikely that your employer will expect you to jump right back in and do everything right away. That's not to say that some employers will not expect that, but really thinking about what you might need. So I encourage people, if they know they're going to be starting work in a couple of weeks, kind of practice what your day is going to look like. Get up at the same time every day, get ready, maybe get in the car and drive to wherever, you know, however long that commute might be. See how you're feeling then. And then just start to put a few of aspects of your day into your work day into your day as you're preparing to go back to work, and then examining where there might be some gaps and where you might need a little bit of assistance. And also, whenever you're asking for anything from an employer, it's really great to come with your own ideas. If you just come to them with a problem and no solution, they might be less likely to want to help you or approve things. But if you come to them and say, this is what might help me, do you feel okay about this, or are there some changes you would want to make? So it's about collaboration a little bit more with that. And again, you don't know until you know. So you might be worried that your focus is going to be off, or that you're going to get really tired by a certain time of day, but you won't know that until you start. And so just try to be creative about ideas about how to approach that with them, and coming with ideas can be really helpful too.
That's great. I love the idea of kind of practicing your work day in advance. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for your time. I neglected to say that Nicole is in another time zone. So she's the real MVP for presenting to all of us tonight. So thank you so much, Nicole. This was so informative. And everyone, like I said, I will email you the slides as soon as I receive them. And if you have an extra minute just to hang out and complete a workshop review, that would be very helpful to us. And I'm going to launch that right now. Thank you so much, Nicole.